Jeremiah 1. Before I formed you, I knew you. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you before you were born. I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. The land of Judah stood on the edge of destruction. Shadows loomed over the kingdom. Warnings of judgment whispered by prophets who walked the streets, calling the people to turn back to God. The people of Israel had strayed, their hearts drawn to idols, their worship divided. Yet in the midst of the darkness, God was raising up a voice, one chosen before birth, one set apart for his purpose. His name was Jeremiah. He was young, inexperienced, and uncertain. The weight of the call pressed upon him, as the word of the Lord came. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you before you were born. I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. The words were overwhelming. Could it be true that before he had drawn his first breath, before he had taken his first steps, God had already chosen him? But doubt crept in. Alas, sovereign Lord, Jeremiah protested, I do not know how to speak. I am too young. Fear gripped his heart. He saw himself as unworthy, unqualified. How could he stand before kings? How could he deliver words of judgment and hope to a rebellious people? But God's call was not based on human ability. It was based on divine purpose. Do not say, I am too young, the Lord replied. You must go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you. Then in that moment, the hand of the Almighty reached out. The Lord touched Jeremiah's mouth and said, I have put my words in your mouth. See, today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms, to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. A message of judgment, a message of hope, a mission that would shake the hearts of kings and test the faith of a nation. Jeremiah's path would not be easy. The people would resist him, they would mock him, they would threaten his life. But God had already spoken. Do not be afraid, for the one who called him was the one who would sustain him. Then the Lord gave him two visions. The first, a branch of an almond tree. You have seen correctly, God said, for I am watching to see that my word is fulfilled. The almond tree was the first to bloom in spring, a sign that what God had spoken would come to pass. His promises would not fail. The second, a boiling pot, tilting from the north. Disaster will be poured out from the north on all who live in the land, the Lord warned. I am calling the kingdoms of the north to bring judgment upon Judah, for they have forsaken me and burned incense to other gods. The message was clear. Judgment was coming, but Jeremiah would not stand alone. Get yourself ready, the Lord commanded. Stand up and say to them whatever I command you. Do not be terrified by them, or I will terrify you before them. Then came a promise, one that would carry Jeremiah through years of rejection, persecution and suffering. Today I have made you a fortified city, an iron pillar, a bronze wall to stand against the whole land, against the kings of Judah, its officials, its priests and the people of the land. They will fight against you but will not overcome you, for I am with you and will rescue you, declares the Lord. And so Jeremiah stood, a prophet, called before birth, a voice chosen to speak truth, a man strengthened not by his own might, but by the power of the Almighty. His message would not be welcomed. He would weep for the people. He would plead with them to turn back. He would endure rejection, imprisonment and threats, but he would not be silenced, because before he was formed, God knew him. Before he was born, God set him apart. And when God appoints, no fear, no opposition, no doubt can stand against his plan. Even today his words remain true. He knows us before we know ourselves. He calls us before we feel ready. He strengthens us when we feel weak. For those who belong to him, there is no mistake in their calling, no accident in their purpose. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. He who called Jeremiah still calls today, and his purposes will never fail. Jeremiah 3. Return to me, for I am merciful. Return, faithless Israel, declares the Lord. I will frown on you no longer, for I am merciful, declares the Lord. I will not be angry forever. The streets of Jerusalem lay silent under the weight of unspoken guilt. Once a city of worship and devotion, now it was filled with the echoes of unfaithfulness. The people of Israel had turned their backs on the one who had led them, loved them and called them his own. They had wandered. They had chased after other gods, offering sacrifices on high places, bowing before idols that could not speak, could not hear, could not save. Yet despite their betrayal, the voice of the Lord still called out. If a man divorces his wife and she leaves him to marry another, should he return to her again? Would not the land be completely defiled? The question hung in the air, heavy with truth. By the laws of men, reconciliation seemed impossible. The unfaithfulness of Israel was like that of a wife who had abandoned her husband, chasing after other lovers. And yet, God was not like men. His mercy was greater than their betrayal. His love was deeper than their sin. You have lived as a prostitute with many lovers, yet return to me, declares the Lord. Through the voice of the prophet Jeremiah, God pleaded with his people. From the hilltops, from the valley groves, in the cities and in the countryside, they had defiled the land with their worship of false gods. They had turned their faces from the one who had carried them out of Egypt, who had led them through the wilderness, who had given them a land flowing with milk and honey. And yet, they did not even feel their shame. Have you not just called to me, my father, my friend from my youth? Will you always be angry? But you do all the evil you can. Judah, the sister nation of Israel, had seen all this. They had watched as the northern kingdom had fallen, as judgment came upon those who had forsaken the Lord. Yet instead of learning from their destruction, Judah followed in their footsteps, pretending to be faithful while their hearts chased after idols. But still God's mercy remained. Return, faithless Israel, declares the Lord. I will frown on you no longer, for I am merciful. I will not be angry forever. Only acknowledge your guilt. You have rebelled against the Lord your God. It was not too late. Though they had turned away, though they had broken the covenant, though they had defiled the land, if they would only return, if they would only acknowledge their sin, he would receive them, not with condemnation, not with rejection, but with mercy. I myself will take you, one from a city and two from a clan, and bring you to Zion. Then I will give you shepherds after my own heart, who will lead you with knowledge and understanding. A new day was coming, a day when the Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of God's presence, would no longer be needed, because his presence would be with them in a greater way. A day when Jerusalem would be called the throne of the Lord, and all nations would gather in worship, no longer stubbornly following their own evil desires, but first repentance. Return, faithless people, declares the Lord, for I am your husband. I will choose you, one from a town and two from a clan, and bring you to Zion. His love remained. His mercy had not run out. Even after betrayal, even after wandering, even after rebellion, his arms were open. But the call required an answer. Truly, in the Lord our God is the salvation of Israel. False gods could not save. Idols could not heal. Only in returning to the Lord would they find restoration. Even today his voice calls, to the wandering, to the lost, to the weary souls chasing after things that do not satisfy. Return to me, for I am merciful, and for those who do, there is healing, there is restoration, there is grace. For his mercy is greater than our sin, and his love is stronger than our failure. Even when we have been faithless, he remains faithful. Jeremiah 6. Stand at the crossroads and seek the ancient paths. Stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths. Ask where the good way is, and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls. The city of Jerusalem stood on the edge of destruction. The streets, once filled with laughter and life, now echoed with uncertainty. The people had wandered far from God, their hearts hardened, their ears deaf to his voice. They had built altars to foreign gods, trusted in their own strength, and ignored the warnings of the prophets. And now judgment was near. The prophet Jeremiah stood at the gates, his voice carrying through the marketplace, calling out to a people who refused to listen. This is what the Lord says: stand at the crossroads and look. Crossroads, a place of decision, a moment of choice. Would they continue down the path of rebellion, trusting in their own wisdom, chasing after the desires of their hearts? Or would they turn back to the ancient ways, the ways of truth, righteousness, and devotion to the Lord? Ask for the ancient paths. Ask where the good way is, and walk in it. The ancient paths, the way of their forefathers, the way of Abraham, who trusted in God's promises, the way of Moses, who led the people in obedience, the way of David, who sought the Lord with all his heart. It was not a new way, nor a hidden one. It had always been there, waiting for them to return. And if they walked in it, you will find rest for your souls. Rest, not just relief from their enemies, not just security for their nation, but a deeper rest, a peace that could only come from being right with God. But the people shook their heads. We will not walk in it. They refused the good way. They rejected the warnings. They silenced the prophets, preferring to listen to those who spoke only what they wanted to hear. False voices filled the land, declaring peace when there was no peace, covering sin with empty words instead of repentance. They dressed the wound of my people as though it were not serious. Peace, peace, they say, when there is no peace. The warning signs were clear. The enemy was coming from the north. Destruction would sweep over the land. Their walls would not save them. Their alliances would fail. Their wealth would be worthless. God had spoken. The choice was before them. I appointed watchmen over you, and said, listen to the sound of the trumpet. But you said, we will not listen. They had closed their ears to the call of repentance. They had hardened their hearts against the mercy of God. And now, judgment was near. But even in the midst of warning, hope remained. For those who would listen, for those who would turn back, for those who would seek the ancient paths and walk in them. The crossroads still stood before them, and it stands before us today. Every day we are faced with the same choice: the way of the world, filled with self-reliance, compromise and fleeting pleasures, or the way of the Lord, marked by truth, righteousness, and eternal peace. Stand at the crossroads and look. Look at where your path is leading. Look at the fruit of your choices. Look at the voice calling you back. Ask for the ancient paths. Ask where the good way is, and walk in it. His way has never changed. It is the way of faith, the way of obedience, the way of surrender. And for those who walk in it, there is rest. Not just rest from the burdens of life, but rest for the soul, a peace that the world cannot give, and nothing can take away. The choice remains. Which path will you walk? Jeremiah 9. Let not the wise boast, but boast in knowing the Lord. Let not the wise boast of their wisdom, or the strong boast of their strength, or the rich boast of their riches. But let the one who boasts boast about this, that they have the understanding to know me, that I am the Lord, who exercises kindness, justice and righteousness on earth. For in these I delight. The streets of Jerusalem were filled with voices, merchants calling out their wares, scribes debating knowledge, rulers boasting of their power. The city stood proud, its leaders trusting in their wisdom, its warriors confident in their might, its wealthy secure in their riches. But the voice of the prophet rose above them all, a voice of mourning, a cry of lament. Oh, that my head were a spring of water, and my eyes a fountain of tears. I would weep day and night for my people who have been slain. Jeremiah grieved for the nation, not because of an enemy at the gates, not because of famine or drought, but because of the sin that had taken root deep in their hearts. They had abandoned the Lord. They had exchanged truth for lies, justice for corruption, and devotion for empty rituals. Their lips spoke of God, but their hearts were far from Him. They make ready their tongue like a bow, to shoot lies. It is not by truth that they triumph in the land. Deceit, betrayal, self-reliance. The people boasted in their knowledge, their strategies, their wealth. They measured success by what they could see, by what they could control. But the Lord was watching. Should I not punish them for this, declares the Lord? Should I not avenge myself on such a nation as this? The walls they trusted would crumble. The wealth they stored up would be plundered. The strength they boasted in would fail them. And then when everything was stripped away, the truth would stand. Only one thing mattered. Let not the wise boast of their wisdom, or the strong boast of their strength, or the rich boast of their riches. But let the one who boasts boast about this, that they have the understanding to know me, not wisdom, not strength, not wealth, but knowing the Lord, to know his heart, to walk in his ways, to trust in his character. For I am the Lord who exercises kindness, justice and righteousness on the earth. For in these I delight. Kindness, justice, righteousness, these were the things that lasted. These were the things that mattered. And yet the people turned away. They worshipped idols of silver and gold. They placed their confidence in alliances and armies. They sought protection in the works of their own hands rather than in the presence of their God. So judgment would come. The land would become desolate. The cities would be emptied. The people would be scattered. But even in wrath, there was mercy for those who would listen, for those who would return, for those who would seek to know the Lord above all else. The call remains the same today. What do we trust in? What do we boast in? What do we boast in? What holds our confidence when all else is shaken? Do we rely on our own wisdom, believing we can navigate life by our understanding? Do we depend on our own strength, thinking we are secure in our abilities? Do we place our hope in wealth, assuming it will provide all we need? Or do we boast in this, that we know the Lord, that we walk in his ways, that we trust in his name? For I am the Lord, who exercises kindness, justice and righteousness on the earth. For in these I delight. These are the things that will endure. And for those who seek him, for those who humble themselves and turn back, he is faithful to reveal himself. The streets of Jerusalem once echoed with pride, and soon they would echo with sorrow. But to the remnant who would listen, to those who would forsake their own wisdom, strength and riches for the sake of knowing God, there was hope, and that hope remains for us today. Jeremiah 11. The Lord's covenant and his everlasting promises. Obey me, and do everything I command you, and you will be my people, and I will be your God. Then I will fulfill the oath I swore to your ancestors, to give them a land flowing with milk and honey, the land you possess today. The air was heavy with the weight of prophecy. As Jeremiah walked through the streets of Jerusalem, the people moved about their business, trading, building, living, unaware that judgment loomed on the horizon. The Lord had spoken to Jeremiah, his voice firm yet sorrowful. Listen to the terms of this covenant, and tell them to the people of Judah, and to those who live in Jerusalem. A covenant, a sacred promise. Long ago the Lord had chosen this people, calling them out of slavery, leading them through the wilderness, and planting them in a land of abundance. He had given them his law, his protection, his presence, and in return, he had asked for their faithfulness. Obey me, and I will be your God. Walk in my ways, and you will be my people. It was not a burden, but a promise, a life of blessing, a future of peace, a relationship with the Almighty. But they had turned away, yet they did not listen or pay attention. Instead, they followed the stubbornness of their evil hearts. The covenant had been broken. The people had worshipped other gods, bowing before lifeless idols, chasing after nations that did not know the Lord. They had trusted in alliances instead of in their deliverer, in wealth instead of in his provision, in their own ways instead of his commands. And now, the consequences were coming. I will bring on them a disaster they cannot escape. Although they cry out to me, I will not listen to them. The words were heavy, final, yet they were not spoken in anger alone, but in grief. The Lord had been patient. He had sent prophets to warn them, calling them back to the covenant, pleading for their return. But they had refused to listen. Do not pray for this people, nor offer any plea or petition for them. because I will not listen when they call to me in their time of distress. Judgment would come, the cities would fall, the land would be stripped bare, but even in judgment, God's promises remained. Though they had broken the covenant, he would not break his word, for his faithfulness was not like man's. His love was not fleeting. One day, he would restore them. One day, he would make a new covenant, one not written on tablets of stone, but on hearts of flesh. I will put my law in their minds, and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. The Lord's promises would endure, and today, they still stand. He calls us to obedience, not as a burden, but as an invitation, a life of blessing, a future of peace, a relationship with the Almighty. But we must choose. Do we follow our own ways, trusting in the things of this world, or do we walk in his covenant, trusting in the one who never fails? Obey me, and I will be your God. The call remains, the promise is everlasting, and for those who listen, for those who turn back, his arms are always open. Jeremiah 15. I am with you to save and deliver you. I will save you from the hands of the wicked, and deliver you from the grasp of the cruel. The city of Jerusalem stood defiant, its streets filled with merchants and laborers, its leaders seated in comfort behind stone walls. But the air carried a weight, an unseen heaviness that only a prophet could feel. Jeremiah walked through the city, his heart burdened, his spirit weary. The Lord had spoken, and the words burned within him. Even if Moses and Samuel were to stand before me, my heart would not go out to this people. Send them away from my presence. Let them go. The judgment was set. Disaster would come. The nation had turned its back on the Lord, chasing after false gods, trusting in the strength of their own hands rather than the one who had formed them. The people had rejected his warnings, despised his prophets, silenced his truth, and now the time of mercy was closing. Those destined for death, to death, those for the sword, to the sword, those for starvation, to starvation, those for captivity, to captivity. The words echoed in Jeremiah's soul. He had spoken what God commanded. He had warned them. He had pleaded with them, yet they had mocked him. They had scorned his words. They had plotted against him. Why is my pain unending, and my wound grievous and incurable? Jeremiah had carried the burden of the Lord, but it had become too much. The weight of rejection, the loneliness of his calling, the suffering that came with obedience, it pressed upon him like an iron yoke. He poured out his heart to God, questioning, lamenting, but the Lord did not rebuke him. Instead, he answered with a promise. If you repent, I will restore you that you may serve me. If you utter worthy, not worthless words, you will be my spokesman. A calling that could not be shaken, a purpose that could not be denied. And then, the words that would sustain him. I will make you a wall to this people, a fortified wall of bronze. They will fight against you, but will not overcome you. For I am with you to rescue and save you, declares the Lord. The pain would not end, the trials would not cease, the rejection would not disappear, but neither would the presence of God. The Lord would strengthen him. The Lord would defend him. The Lord would deliver him. I will save you from the hands of the wicked, and deliver you from the grasp of the cruel. The promise was not just for Jeremiah. It is for all who walk in obedience, all who stand for truth, all who carry the call of God. Even when the world rejects them, the storms may rage, the enemies may rise, the road may be lonely, but the Lord is with us. He does not abandon his own. He does not forget his servants. He does not fail to save. And when the battle grows fierce, when our strength fades, when we feel as though we cannot stand another moment, he whispers again, I am with you to save and deliver you. Jeremiah 17. Blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord. But blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence is in him. The streets of Jerusalem were busy with life. Merchants calling out their wares, craftsmen shaping wood and stone, children laughing as they ran through the narrow alleys. The city bustled with activity, but beneath it all a quiet rebellion simmered in the hearts of the people. They had forgotten their God. They worshipped idols made by human hands, trusted in the strength of nations, and placed their hope in kings instead of the King of Kings. The covenant that had once bound them to the Lord, the promises spoken through Moses and the prophets, had been set aside for the false security of wealth, power, and alliances with the world. And so the Lord spoke through his prophet Jeremiah, "Cursed is the one who trusts in man, who draws strength from mere flesh, and whose heart turns away from the Lord. That person will be like a bush in the wastelands. They will not see prosperity when it comes. They will dwell in the parched places of the desert, in a salt land where no one lives." The words were a warning, sharp as a sword, piercing through the illusions of self-sufficiency. Those who trust in their own strength will find themselves barren. Those who lean on human wisdom will wither like a plant in dry land. Those who turn from the Lord will find that all they have built will crumble. The people heard, but they did not listen. They continued in their ways, seeking security in the strength of men, relying on the gods of the nations around them, believing that they could forge their own destiny. Yet even as judgment loomed, the Lord's voice did not end with warning. It carried a promise as well. "But blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence is in him. For the one who trusts in the Lord is not like a withered bush in the wasteland. No, they will be like a tree planted by the water, that sends out its roots by the stream. It does not fear when heat comes. Its leaves are always green. It has no worries in a year of drought, and never fails to bear fruit. A tree rooted deep, a tree unshaken by the storm, a tree sustained by living water. This is the life of the one who trusts in the Lord. Not a life free from trials, not a path without difficulty, but a life that is anchored. When the drought comes, they will not wither. When the heat of hardship presses down, they will not fear. When all else fades, they will continue to bear fruit, because their source is not in man, not in wealth, not in earthly security. Their source is the Lord himself. And yet the greatest struggle of all is this: the heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? The human heart, restless and wandering, so easily trusts in what is seen rather than the unseen. It is quick to chase after false hopes, to believe in temporary solutions, to turn away from God, and then wonder why peace is missing. But the Lord sees deeper than the surface. I, the Lord, search the heart and examine the mind, to reward each person according to their conduct, according to what their deeds deserve. Nothing is hidden from him. No motive escapes his sight. No heart is beyond his reach. The people of Judah trusted in themselves, in their own ways, in the strength of men, and for that they would face the consequences of their rebellion. Yet for the one who turns back, who places their trust not in man, but in the Lord, there is hope. There is always hope. For the tree planted by the water does not plant itself. It is placed there. It is sustained by something greater than itself. And so it is with us. If we trust in ourselves, we will find only emptiness. If we trust in man, we will be disappointed. If we trust in the world, we will be shaken. But if we trust in the Lord, if we anchor ourselves in his promises, if we place our confidence not in what we see but in who he is, then we will stand, then we will endure, then we will thrive. So in a world full of uncertainty, where do you place your trust? In the wisdom of man, or in the wisdom of God? In the strength of your own hands, or in the power of the Almighty? In the fleeting securities of this life, or in the eternal promises of the Lord? Blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord. This is not just a statement. It is an invitation to turn from self-reliance and lean on him, to stop striving and start resting, to stop fearing and start trusting. And when the trials come, when the drought arrives, when the storms rage, you will stand firm. You will not wither. You will not fear. For you will be like a tree planted by the water, whose roots go deep, whose source is not the world, but the living God. Jeremiah 20. The Lord is a mighty warrior, my protector. But the Lord is with me like a mighty warrior, so my persecutors will stumble and not prevail. The weight of his calling pressed upon him like an iron yoke. Jeremiah had spoken the words of the Lord, truth unfiltered, unsoftened, unyielding, and for that, he had suffered. The people did not listen. The priests despised him. The rulers scorned him, and now he found himself in chains. Pasha, the chief officer of the temple, could no longer tolerate the prophet's words, the warnings of destruction, the calls to repentance, the relentless truth. It was too much. So he seized Jeremiah, beat him, and locked him in the stocks at the upper gate of Benjamin, in full view of the people, humiliated, mocked, abused. The city he was called to save now turned against him. The very ones he longed to rescue laughed at his pain. A prophet, rejected, a voice, silenced, a man, broken. And yet, as the morning sun rose over Jerusalem, Jeremiah stood once more. His body bore the bruises of suffering. His soul carried the scars of rejection. But his spirit was unshaken. For the word of the Lord still burned within him. He turned to Pasha, his jailer, his persecutor, and spoke with unwavering resolve. The Lord's name for you is not Pasha, but terror on every side. For the one who had sought to silence the voice of God would soon hear the cries of destruction. Babylon was coming. The city would fall. Those who mocked now would mourn. And Pasha, the one who thought himself powerful, would be taken captive, exiled into darkness, never to return. Jeremiah had spoken the truth, but truth came at a cost. The burden was heavy, the pain was real, the loneliness was suffocating, and in the quiet of his soul, Jeremiah wrestled with his calling. You deceived me, Lord, and I was deceived. You overpowered me and prevailed. I am ridiculed all day long. Everyone mocks me. Had he not been faithful? Had he not declared every word the Lord had given him? And yet, instead of honor he found disgrace. Instead of protection, he found suffering. The temptation to remain silent was strong. To stop speaking, to walk away, to leave behind the call that had only brought him pain. But the word of the Lord was not something he could abandon. But if I say, I will not mention his word or speak any more in his name, his word is in my heart, like a fire shut up in my bones. I am weary of holding it in. Indeed I cannot. He could not run. He could not remain silent. For the message was not his own. It belonged to the Almighty. And though the path was painful, though the cost was high, though the world turned against him, he knew who stood beside him. But the Lord is with me like a mighty warrior, so my persecutors will stumble and not prevail. They could chain his hands, but they could not silence his God. They could strike his body, but they could not break his spirit. They could mock, they could threaten, they could reject, but the Lord was his protector, a mighty warrior, a defender who does not falter, a shield that does not break. Jeremiah lifted his voice in praise, declaring what he knew to be true. Sing to the Lord, give praise to the Lord. He rescues the life of the needy from the hands of the wicked. His pain did not vanish, his struggle did not end, but his faith remained. For the Lord was with him, not just as a distant deity, not just as a silent observer, but as a mighty warrior. And though the world raged against him, though darkness pressed in, though his soul wrestled with doubt, he was not alone. He was never alone. Neither are we. For the same mighty warrior who stood with Jeremiah stands with us. In trials he is our protector. In opposition, he is our shield. In suffering, he is our strength. And though the world may rise against us, though we may face rejection, hardship and pain, the Lord fights for his own, and in him we will not be shaken. Jeremiah 23. The righteous branch. The Lord is our shepherd. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, a king who will reign wisely and do what is just and right in the land. The land was heavy with corruption, the weight of injustice pressing down upon the people. The shepherds, those entrusted with leading, guiding, and protecting, had failed in their calling. Instead of tending to the flock, they had scattered them. Instead of feeding the weak, they had grown fat themselves. The priests twisted the truth. The prophets spoke words the people wanted to hear, not what the Lord had commanded. The kings sought their own gain, their own power, their own glory, and the people, they wandered, lost and afraid, searching for guidance but finding none. The Lord watched. He saw the suffering, the confusion, the betrayal of those who should have been faithful. He saw the leaders who had abandoned their duty, and he spoke, "Woe to the shepherds who are destroying and scattering the sheep of my pasture, declares the Lord. Because you have scattered my flock and driven them away, I will bestow punishment on you for the evil you have done." The warning was clear. Judgment was coming, not just upon the people, but upon those who had led them astray. The unfaithful shepherds would be held accountable. They had turned their backs on truth, had chosen power over righteousness, had allowed sin to flourish among the people of God, and now they would face the consequences. But the Lord's judgment was not without hope. In the midst of his warning, a promise rose like the first light of dawn. "I myself will gather the remnant of my flock," he declared. "I will bring them back to their pasture, where they will be fruitful and increase in number. I will place shepherds over them who will tend them, and they will no longer be afraid or terrified, nor will any be missing." The people had been scattered, but they would not remain so. The Lord himself would gather them, like a shepherd calling his sheep home. No longer would they be lost. No longer would they be vulnerable. No longer would they suffer under the hands of leaders who cared only for themselves. But the promise did not end there. It stretched beyond the moment, beyond the coming years, beyond the exile and return. It reached towards something greater, someone greater. "The days are coming," declares the Lord, "when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, a king who will reign wisely and do what is just and right in the land." A king was coming, not like the kings of Judah who had failed their people, not like the rulers who had abandoned righteousness. This king would be different. He would be wise. He would be just. He would not seek power for himself but would rule with truth and compassion. And his name, the Lord our righteous Savior. The people of Israel waited. The days of exile would come, the pain of loss, the weight of judgment. But beyond it all, they clung to the promise of the righteous King, a shepherd who would not fail them, a leader who would not turn away, a Savior who would make all things right. And generations later, in the town of Bethlehem, a child would be born, a son of David, a king who would reign forever, a shepherd who would gather his lost sheep. He would stand among the people, looking upon them with compassion, calling them to himself. "I am the good shepherd," he would say. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The leaders of his day would be no different than those of Jeremiah's time, corrupt, self-serving, unfaithful to their calling. But the true shepherd had come. The righteous branch had been raised up. The king had arrived, and even now his voice calls out, to the lost, to the weary, to the scattered. He gathers, he restores, he leads his people to green pastures, to still waters, to the place where fear is no more. For the Lord is our shepherd, and in him we lack nothing. Jeremiah 29. "For I know the plans I have for you. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you, and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future." The streets of Babylon were filled with voices, merchants calling out their wares, children running through the alleyways, the scent of spices and burning oil thick in the air. But for the people of Israel, these streets were not home. They walked them as exiles, their hearts burdened by the weight of displacement, longing for the land they had lost. 70 years. That was the decree. The prophets had warned them, but they had not listened. And now, they sat by the rivers of Babylon, weeping as they remembered Zion. They had lost everything, their temple, their homes, their city, and in their sorrow, many had begun to lose something even greater, hope. They cried out, asking if God had abandoned them. Had he forgotten his promises? Had he turned his face away forever? Their prayers felt unanswered, their dreams shattered, and in the midst of their despair, false prophets rose among them, whispering words they longed to hear. "You will go home soon," they said. The exile will not last. God will break the yoke of Babylon, lies disguised as comfort. But then came a letter, a message carried from Jerusalem, written by the prophet Jeremiah, the man they had once ignored. His words were not what they expected. Build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce, marry and have sons and daughters, seek the peace and prosperity of the city, where I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Stay. That was the command, not to resist, not to rebel, not to escape. Stay, build, plant, grow, seek the good of the place where they had been sent. It was not the answer they wanted, but it was the answer they needed, for God had not forgotten them. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. 70 years, a lifetime for many, but the promise remained. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Hope, not in immediate rescue, not in an easy path, but in the faithfulness of God. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, and I will bring you back from captivity. God had not abandoned them, even in exile, even in the waiting. He was working. His plans were not ruined by their failures. His purpose was not undone by their suffering. Every moment was woven into his greater story, a story of redemption, restoration, and return. And so, they had a choice, to despair or to trust, to mourn what was lost or to build where they were, to believe the lies of the false prophets or to hold fast to the promise of God. The years would pass, generations would come and go, but in time, the words of Jeremiah would prove true. A king named Cyrus would rise, and the decree would be given: go home, rebuild, return, and they would, because the plans of the Lord never fail. Even in exile, even in waiting, even when the path is unclear, for he knows the plans he has for his people, and they are good. Jeremiah 30. I am with you and will save you. I am with you and will save you, declares the Lord. Though I completely destroy all the nations among which I scatter you, I will not completely destroy you. I will discipline you, but only in due measure. I will not let you go entirely unpunished. The night was long, the air thick with the weight of sorrow. The people of Israel, scattered and weary, looked upon their broken land with eyes full of longing. The city that once stood as a beacon of promise now lay in ruin, its walls torn down, its streets silent. The pain of exile was heavy upon them, a reminder of their rebellion, of a judgment they had brought upon themselves. Yet in the midst of desolation a voice rose, a voice not of condemnation, but of hope. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says: write in a book all the words I have spoken to you. The prophet Jeremiah held the words of the Almighty, words that carried the weight of divine promise. Though darkness had settled, the dawn was near. Though sorrow had come, joy would return. The Lord had not forgotten his people, nor had he abandoned his covenant. A whisper of restoration echoed through the land. Do not be afraid, Jacob my servant. Do not be dismayed, Israel. I will surely save you out of a distant place, your descendants from the land of their exile. Jacob will again have peace and security, and no one will make him afraid. The exiles listened, their hearts stirring at the promise. Could it be true? Could their suffering have an end? Could the land of their forefathers be restored to them once more? The Lord spoke again, his words unshaken, his promise unwavering. I will restore you to health and heal your wounds, because you are called an outcast, Zion for whom no one cares. Tears fell, for they had felt forgotten, abandoned, forsaken. But the Lord had never turned away. Even in their punishment he had watched over them. Even in their exile his presence had never departed. Nations had risen against them, enemies had rejoiced in their downfall. But the Lord, the righteous one, had seen it all. He had measured their suffering, counted their tears, And now, the time of healing was at hand. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will bring my people Israel and Judah back from captivity, and restore them to the land I gave their ancestors to possess. The land long left desolate would once again hear the laughter of children, the songs of the redeemed, the prayers of the faithful. The cities would be rebuilt, the vineyards planted, the flocks would graze in green pastures, and the Lord himself would walk among his people once more. You will be my people, and I will be your God. Through trial and discipline, through sorrow and loss, the promise had never changed. Though the road was long, though the pain was real, the Lord's love remained unbroken, his covenant unshaken. The people lifted their eyes, no longer consumed by despair, but held by hope. For the one who had scattered them was the one who would gather them again. The one who had disciplined them was the one who would restore them in mercy. I am with you and will save you, the Lord declared. Not just in the past, not just in the distant future, but now. For those who had lost everything, he would give back more than they had ever imagined. For those who had wept in exile, he would bring joy in their return. For those who had wandered far, he would call them home. And as the sun rose over the land that had once been barren, a new dawn began. For the Lord had spoken, and his word would never fail. No distance was too great, no wound was too deep, no exile was too long, for the Lord was with them, and he would save them. Jeremiah 31. I have loved you with an everlasting love. I have loved you with an everlasting love. I have drawn you with unfailing kindness. The sun cast a golden hue over the hills of Israel, painting the sky with soft shades of crimson and gold. A lone traveler walked along a dusty road, his heart heavy with the weight of exile. He had seen destruction, lived through loss, and felt the deep ache of a people displaced. But now as he walked, a voice whispered through the wind, a voice of promise, a voice of love. The people who survived the sword will find favor in the wilderness. I will come to give rest to Israel. He paused, lifting his eyes to the vast sky above. He had seen the wilderness, the barren lands where hope seemed to fade like the morning mist. But here was a promise of restoration, a promise that the same God who had allowed them to be scattered would gather them once more. I have loved you with an everlasting love. I have drawn you with unfailing kindness. These were not words of fleeting affection, they were words of covenant, words that stretched beyond time. Even in their rebellion, even in their wandering, they had never been forgotten. His love was not conditional, not swayed by their failures, but steadfast and enduring. Again you will take up your timbrels and go out to dance with the joyful. Could it be true? Could sorrow be turned to joy? Could the ruins of the past be rebuilt? He had seen cities in ashes, walls crumbled and hearts broken, and yet, here was the voice of the Almighty declaring a future of celebration. You will plant vineyards on the hills of Samaria. The farmers will plant them and enjoy their fruit. The land that had been left desolate would flourish once more. The same ground that had been trampled by invaders would yield harvests of abundance. It was not just a promise of physical restoration, but of spiritual renewal. God was not merely bringing them back to a land. He was bringing them back to himself. See, I will bring them from the land of the north and gather them from the ends of the earth. The traveler closed his eyes, picturing the scattered ones returning home. Sons and daughters, young and old, all led by the gentle hand of their shepherd. No one forgotten, no one left behind. They will come with weeping. They will pray as I bring them back. Tears would be shed, not of sorrow but of overwhelming grace. They had wandered far, but they were never out of reach. They had been lost but never abandoned. The road home would be lined with mercy, each step guided by the love of the Father. For the Lord will deliver Jacob and redeem them from the hand of those stronger than they. It was not by their own might that they would return. It was not by their own strength that they would be redeemed. The Lord himself would fight for them. He alone would bring them out of captivity, out of despair, into the light of his promises. They will be like a well-watered garden, and they will sorrow no more. The traveler knelt upon the earth, running his fingers through the dust. A garden, a place of life, of beauty, of provision. That was what they were meant to be. Not a people defined by ruin, but by renewal. Not by sorrow, but by joy. I will turn their mourning into gladness. I will give them comfort and joy instead of sorrow. The pain of the past would not be erased, but it would be redeemed. The nights of weeping would give way to mornings of dancing. Where once there was grief, there would be comfort. Where once there was despair, there would be joy. Is not Ephraim my dear son, the child in whom I delight? The voice was tender now, like that of a father longing for his child. They had strayed, but they had never ceased to be his own. Even in discipline, his love had never wavered. Even in exile, his heart had never turned away. Set up road signs, put up guideposts, take note of the highway, the road that you take. Return, Virgin Israel, return to your towns. The way back was marked, the path laid out. They were not wandering blindly. The voice of the Lord had gone before them, calling them home. For I have loved you with an everlasting love. The traveler rose to his feet, a new light in his eyes. This was not a love that faded with time. It was not a love that wavered with circumstance. It was everlasting, unbreakable, unrelenting. The road ahead was long, but the promise was sure. He took a deep breath, the scent of coming rain in the air, and with steady steps he walked forward, not just toward a land, but toward the heart of the one who had never stopped loving him, and neither has he stopped loving us. No distance is too great, no failure is too deep, no past is too broken, for he has loved us with an everlasting love. Jeremiah 32. Nothing is too hard for the Lord. I am the Lord, the God of all mankind. Is anything too hard for me? The city stood on the brink of destruction. The walls of Jerusalem, once strong and unshaken, now bore the scars of siege. The Babylonians surrounded the city, their armies pressing in, their weapons poised for the final blow. Fear gripped the hearts of the people, and despair whispered through the streets. And in the midst of it all, Jeremiah sat in prison. He had spoken the words of the Lord, prophesied of judgment, warned of exile, and for this he had been silenced, locked away by the king, who did not want to hear the truth. But though chains bound his hands, the word of the Lord could not be restrained. Then the Lord spoke to him again. Your cousin Hanamah will come to you and say, buy my field at Anathoth, because as nearest relative it is your right and duty to buy it. A field, in a time of war, when the nation itself was crumbling. It made no sense. The land was already as good as lost. The armies of Babylon would soon take everything. And yet, just as the Lord had said, Hanamah arrived, offering Jeremiah the deed to the land. Jeremiah knew this was not a human plan. It was a divine command. And so, despite the hopelessness that surrounded him, he obeyed. He weighed out the silver, signed the deed, and sealed it before witnesses. Then, placing the documents in a clay jar, he declared, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel says, houses, fields, and vineyards will again be bought in this land. To those who heard, it must have seemed foolish to buy land when defeat was certain, to invest in a future when exile was inevitable. But Jeremiah knew that the word of the Lord did not fail, and so he prayed, Our sovereign Lord, you have made the heavens and the earth by your great power and outstretched arm. Nothing is too hard for you. He recounted the mighty works of God, how he had led Israel out of Egypt with signs and wonders, how he had given them the promised land. And yet now the city faced ruin. Because of their disobedience, the people had turned away, rejected God's commands, and chased after idols. The consequences had come, and still, the Lord answered with hope. I am the Lord, the God of all mankind. Is anything too hard for me? Yes, judgment would come. The Babylonians would take the city. The people would go into exile. But that would not be the end of the story. I will surely gather them from all the lands where I banished them in my furious anger and great wrath. I will bring them back to this place and let them live in safety. They will be my people, and I will be their God. The covenant was not broken. The promise had not failed. Though the darkness was deep, the light of restoration would shine again. The day would come when laughter would return to the streets of Jerusalem, when fields would be bought and vineyards would be planted. The same God who brought judgment would bring redemption. The same hands that allowed destruction would rebuild what was lost. Jeremiah held on to that hope. The clay jar that held the deed was a witness to the faithfulness of God. It was a testimony that no matter how impossible things seemed, nothing was too hard for the Lord. And even today, that truth remains. No situation is beyond His power. No brokenness is beyond His healing. No promise is beyond His fulfillment. When all seems lost, when the world crumbles around you, when the future looks uncertain, remember, nothing is too hard for the Lord. Jeremiah 33. Call to me, and I will answer you. Call to me, and I will answer you and tell you great and unsearchable things you do not know. The city lay in ruins. Smoke curled into the sky, the scent of destruction heavy in the air. Jerusalem, once proud and fortified, now stood broken. Its walls, once strong, had crumbled under the weight of siege. The streets were silent, save for the whispers of those who remained, clinging to hope like a dying ember. Jeremiah sat in the courtyard of the guard, a prisoner in his own city. He had spoken the words of the Lord, had warned of this very destruction, yet few had listened. And now the people of Judah suffered under the weight of their rebellion. Their once great kingdom had fallen. Their strength had turned to dust. Yet even in the midst of judgment, God spoke again. Call to me, and I will answer you. The voice of the Lord was not one of condemnation, but of promise. Though the city had fallen, though the people were scattered, God had not abandoned them. His plans had not changed. His love had not faded. I will bring health and healing to it. I will heal my people, and will let them enjoy abundant peace and security. Jeremiah closed his eyes, letting the words settle deep within him. It was hard to see beyond the destruction, beyond the pain. The present moment was filled with sorrow. Yet God spoke of restoration, a future not yet seen, but already promised. I will restore the fortunes of Judah and Israel, and will rebuild them as they were before. It was a declaration of hope. God did not promise to leave them in their suffering. He did not promise only survival, but restoration. The ruins would not remain ruins. The streets would once again echo with laughter. The city gates would once again welcome the faithful. What was lost would be found, and what was broken would be made whole. They will be in awe, and will tremble at the abundant prosperity and peace I provide for them. Jeremiah lifted his gaze to the heavens. The sky stretched wide above him, vast and unchanging. The Lord was still sovereign. The same God who had allowed this judgment was the same God who would bring redemption. Nothing was too far gone. No ruin was beyond His power to restore. Give thanks to the Lord Almighty, for the Lord is good. His love endures forever. The words of old, spoken in days of joy, now rang through the desolation. Could it be? Could such a promise stand even in the face of destruction? Jeremiah knew the answer. The love of God was not bound by circumstances. His faithfulness was not dictated by human failure. His promises did not wither under the weight of hardship. This is what the Lord says: David will never fail to have a man to sit on the throne of Israel. A greater promise, a greater hope. Even in the wreckage, God pointed to the coming king, the one who would reign in righteousness forever. The people of Israel had seen kings rise and fall, had watched earthly rulers lead them astray. But this king would be different. This king would be everlasting. If you can break my covenant with the day, and my covenant with the night, so that day and night no longer come at their appointed time, then my covenant with David, my servant, can be broken. The certainty of God's promises was as sure as the rising sun. Just as day followed night, just as the stars held their place in the heavens, so too would the word of the Lord stand firm. What He had spoken, He would fulfill. What He had promised, He would bring to pass. I will restore their fortunes, and have compassion on them. The ruins would not be the final word. The suffering would not be forever. God was still writing the story, and it was one of redemption. Jeremiah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of both sorrow and hope. He had seen the judgment of the Lord, but he had also heard his promise, and he knew, even in the darkest of days, even in the midst of exile and suffering, God had not abandoned his people. They only had to call, and he would answer. Jeremiah 35. The obedience of the Rechabites. A lesson in faithfulness. We will obey the command of our forefather Jonadab, son of Rechab, in all that he charged us. The streets of Jerusalem bustled with life, merchants calling out their wares, children running through narrow alleys, the hum of the city filling the air. But in one quiet house, a gathering had been called. The Lord had spoken to Jeremiah, sending him on an unusual task. Go to the house of the Rechabites, and bring them into one of the rooms of the temple. Offer them wine to drink. The Rechabites were a peculiar people, a nomadic clan that had held fast to the teachings of their forefather, Jonadab, son of Rechab. They lived in tents, refrained from planting vineyards, and never drank wine. Their way of life was simple, a commitment passed down through generations. Jeremiah found them and led them into one of the inner rooms of the temple. Before them, he set jugs of wine and cups, an invitation to partake. The prophet watched as they exchanged glances, their resolve unwavering. Then they spoke. We do not drink wine, because our forefather Jonadab, son of Rechab, commanded us. Neither you nor your descendants must ever drink wine. You must never build houses, sow seed, or plant vineyards. You must always live in tents, so that you may live long in the land where you reside. They had obeyed. For generations they had held fast to these commands, living as sojourners in the land, their faithfulness unshaken. Even now, in the midst of Jerusalem, surrounded by the comforts of the city, they would not waver. Jeremiah listened, and the word of the Lord came to him. Go and tell the people of Judah and those living in Jerusalem, will you not learn a lesson and obey my words? The commands of Jonadab, son of Rechab, have been faithfully followed by his descendants to this day, but you have not listened to me. The contrast was stark. A human command had been honored for generations, but the voice of the Lord had been ignored. Time and again, he had sent his prophets, calling his people back, urging them to turn from their ways, yet they refused to listen. Therefore, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says: I am bringing disaster on Jerusalem and all the people of Judah, because they have not listened to me or obeyed my words. But to the Rechabites, a different promise was given. Because of their obedience, their steadfast commitment to the commands of their forefather, the Lord made a declaration. Jonadab, son of Rechab, will never fail to have a descendant to serve me. Faithfulness, obedience, a steadfast heart that holds to the ways of the Lord. The lesson of the Rechabites echoes through time, a call to unwavering devotion. While the world shifts and cultures change, there is power in steadfast faith, in obedience that does not falter. The Lord still calls his people to faithfulness, to listen, to obey, to trust that his ways are good. For those who walk in his path, there is a promise that endures. Jonadab, son of Rechab, will never fail to have a descendant to serve me, and the God who honors faithfulness still reigns today. Jeremiah 39. The Lord delivers his people in times of trial, but I will rescue you on that day, declares the Lord. You will not be given into the hands of those you fear. I will save you. You will not fall by the sword, but will escape with your life because you trust in me, declares the Lord. The city was burning. Jerusalem, once proud and mighty, lay in ruins. The walls that had stood for centuries were broken, torn apart by the relentless siege of Babylon. Smoke filled the air, the cries of the defeated echoing through the streets. The once thriving city was now a place of despair, its people either slaughtered or taken captive, its glory turned to dust. The judgment of the Lord had come. For years Jeremiah had spoken the words of warning. He had pleaded with the people, with the kings, with the rulers. Turn back to the Lord, obey his voice, and you will live. But his warnings had fallen on deaf ears. They mocked him, they imprisoned him, they treated him as a traitor. And now, the day he had foretold had arrived. Nebuchadnezzar's army had breached the city. King Zedekiah, in fear had fled by night, hoping to escape. But he was caught, dragged before the Babylonian king, and made to watch as his sons were slaughtered before his eyes. Then they put out his eyes, and led him away in chains. The people were taken captive, led away in sorrow, bound for Babylon. Those who had once walked freely in Jerusalem now found themselves prisoners in a foreign land. But in the midst of judgment, in the heart of destruction, there was still mercy. Ebed-Melech, the Ethiopian, had once risked his life for Jeremiah. When the prophet had been cast into a muddy cistern to die, this foreigner, an outsider, had spoken up. He had pleaded with the king, and by his intervention, Jeremiah had been rescued. And now, the Lord spoke a word of deliverance over him. I will rescue you on that day. Ebed-Melech had feared the coming destruction, had feared the wrath of Babylon, but the Lord had seen his faithfulness. While the kings and nobles had rejected God's word, this man had shown kindness to his prophet, and for that, he would be spared. Because you trust in me, amidst the fire, the ruin, and the suffering, those who trusted in the Lord would find deliverance. Though the city had fallen, God had not abandoned his own. His justice had come, but his mercy remained. For Jeremiah, the trial had been long. He had faced rejection, persecution, and imprisonment. He had watched his nation crumble under its own rebellion. But even in the darkest moments, he had clung to the words the Lord had spoken. I am with you, and will rescue you. And now, as the city burned, and the captives were led away, Jeremiah remained, set free by the Babylonians, untouched by the destruction. He stood as a witness to the faithfulness of God, because the Lord delivers those who trust in him, even in times of trial, even when all seems lost, even when the world crumbles around them. The judgment of Jerusalem was not the end of the story. The exile would not last forever. The Lord had promised restoration, and in time, he would bring his people home. For the God who judges is also the God who saves. The one who brings justice is also the one who redeems. And to those who trust in him, he speaks the same promise. I will rescue you on that day. You will escape with your life, because you trust in me. The fire may rage, the storm may come, the enemy may rise, but the Lord delivers his people, and nothing can stand against his hand. Jeremiah 42. If you obey my voice, I will be your refuge. If you stay in this land, I will build you up and not tear you down. I will plant you and not uproot you. For I have relented concerning the disaster I have inflicted on you. Do not be afraid of the king of Babylon, whom you now fear. Do not be afraid of him, declares the Lord. For I am with you, and will save you, and deliver you from his hands. The people stood before Jeremiah, their faces weary, their hearts burdened with fear. The land of Judah lay in ruins, the judgment of the Lord having swept through like a storm, leaving devastation in its wake. The mighty Babylonian army had conquered Jerusalem, and those who remained felt vulnerable, like sheep without a shepherd. A remnant had survived, but they did not know what to do. Uncertainty clouded their minds. Should they remain in the land, trusting that God would protect them, or should they flee to Egypt, seeking refuge under its shadow? The path ahead seemed unclear, and so they turned to the prophet of the Lord. Pray to the Lord your God for us, they pleaded with Jeremiah, that he may show us the way we should go, and the thing we should do. Whether it is favorable or unfavorable, we will obey the Lord our God. Jeremiah listened to their request and sought the Lord. For 10 days he waited upon the word of the Almighty, and then the answer came, clear, firm and full of promise. If you stay in this land, I will build you up and not tear you down. I will plant you and not uproot you. Do not be afraid of the king of Babylon, for I am with you and will save you. I will show you compassion, and he will have mercy on you, and restore you to your land. It was a promise of hope, a reassurance that if they trusted in the Lord and remained in the land, he would be their refuge. Though the scars of war were fresh, though fear still gripped their hearts, God's protection would be upon them. His mercy would overshadow their weakness. His presence would sustain them in the midst of uncertainty. But the word of the Lord did not end there. A warning followed. If you say, "We will not stay in this land," and instead go to Egypt, thinking you will escape war and hunger, then hear the word of the Lord. The very sword you fear will overtake you there, and famine will follow you. You will perish in the place where you seek refuge. Egypt seemed safe. It seemed secure, a land of abundance, a stronghold against the might of Babylon. But it was not where God had called them to be. The Lord knew their hearts. He saw their temptation to take matters into their own hands, to rely on earthly strength rather than divine guidance. Do not deceive yourselves, Jeremiah warned, for you asked for the word of the Lord, and now you must obey. If you disobey, destruction will follow. But if you trust, He will be your refuge. The people heard the words, but in their hearts, fear still warred against faith. Would they trust in the unseen protection of God, or would they seek security in the power of men? And so the choice stood before them, to obey and be preserved, or to disobey and face ruin. The Lord had spoken. His promise was clear. His warning was firm. But would they listen? Even now that same call echoes through the ages. In times of uncertainty, in seasons of fear, the Lord's voice remains steadfast. If you obey my voice, I will be your refuge. A call to trust, a call to surrender, a call to remain under the shelter of the Almighty. For those who listen, His presence is their fortress. For those who stay, His hand is their shield, and in Him they will never be forsaken. Jeremiah 46. Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be afraid, Jacob my servant. Do not be dismayed, Israel. I will surely save you out of a distant place, your descendants from the land of their exile. Jacob will again have peace and security, and no one will make him afraid. The armies of Egypt had once stood proud, their chariots shining under the sun, their banners fluttering in the wind as they marched with confidence. Pharaoh Necho, mighty in his day, had trusted in his strength, his alliances, his gods of stone and gold. He had believed his kingdom invincible, his power without end. But the word of the Lord had come, and all the might of Egypt was nothing before his judgment. This is the message of the Lord concerning the army of Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, declared the prophet. Prepare your shields, ready your horses, and march to battle. But why do I see them terrified? They are retreating, their warriors defeated. Terror is on every side. The soldiers who had once stood firm now fled in confusion, their strength melting away like wax before the fire. The swords of their enemies struck without mercy, their cries filling the air as their walls crumbled. Egypt, the nation that had once held Israel in chains, now knew the weight of fear. Their pride had led them to war, but their strength was powerless against the hand of the Almighty. Yet amid the judgment of the nations, the voice of the Lord spoke a different word to his people, to Israel, trembling in exile, uncertain of the future, feeling abandoned and small. He spoke comfort. Do not be afraid, Jacob my servant. Do not be dismayed, Israel, for I will save you from afar, your descendants from the land of their captivity. Though they had been scattered, though they had been disciplined, they were not forgotten. The Lord had not forsaken them, nor would he leave them to perish among the nations. He had seen their suffering, their fears, their longing for home, and he would act. Jacob will again have peace and security, and no one will make him afraid. The people had known fear. They had seen their cities burn, their families torn apart, their temple destroyed. They had walked the streets of Babylon, strangers in a foreign land, surrounded by gods they did not know, and rulers who did not fear the Lord. Yet even in exile, the promise remained. The Lord had not changed. The same God who had parted the sea, who had led them through the wilderness, who had brought them into the land of promise, he was still with them. The nations would rise and fall. Egypt, Babylon, all the great kingdoms of the earth would know their day of reckoning. But Israel's hope was not in the strength of man. Their future did not rest in the hands of kings or armies, but in the word of the Lord. I am with you, declares the Lord. I will not completely destroy you, though I will discipline you with justice. I will not let you go entirely unpunished. His discipline was not rejection. His correction was not abandonment. The Lord was shaping his people, refining them, preparing them for restoration. Though they walked through trials, he walked with them. Though they faced hardship, he held them in his hands. To the nations he was a God of judgment, shaking the earth, tearing down kingdoms. But to his people, he was a father, calling them home, whispering words of comfort in the midst of the storm. The armies of the earth would rise and fall. Egypt would know defeat. Babylon would crumble. The kingdoms of men would pass away, but the covenant of the Lord would stand. Do not fear, for I am with you. Not the strength of Egypt, not the might of Babylon, not exile, nor war, nor the passage of time could separate them from the love of their God. His faithfulness endured, his promises remained, and though they walked through the valley of uncertainty, they would not walk alone, for he was their refuge, their deliverer, their king forever, and in him they would find peace once more. Jeremiah 50. The Lord redeems his people from captivity. In those days, at that time, declares the Lord, the people of Israel and the people of Judah together will go in tears to seek the Lord their God. They will ask the way to Zion and turn their faces toward it. They will come and bind themselves to the Lord in an everlasting covenant that will not be forgotten. The city stood in silence, its towering walls cracked and worn, its streets littered with the remnants of a fallen kingdom. Babylon, once mighty, once unshakable, was now a shadow of what it had been. The great empire that had ruled the nations with an iron fist would soon face the justice of the Lord. For too long, Babylon had held the people of Israel and Judah in chains. The captives had wept by the rivers of their oppressors, longing for their homeland, their temple, their God. They had suffered under the weight of exile, the burden of foreign rule pressing upon their shoulders. But their sorrow would not last forever. Babylon will fall, the Lord declared. A nation from the north will come against her and lay waste to her land. Her warriors will be shattered, her gates broken, her idols cast down. The proud kingdom that had exalted itself above all others, that had boasted in its strength and its wealth, would be brought low. The Lord himself would bring judgment upon Babylon for its cruelty, for its arrogance, for the suffering it had inflicted upon his people. But the judgment of Babylon was not the end of the story. A greater promise lay beyond the fall of the empire, a promise of redemption. My people have been lost sheep. Their shepherds have led them astray and caused them to roam on the mountains. They wandered over mountain and hill and forgot their resting place. Whoever found them devoured them. The Lord had seen his people in their suffering. He had heard their cries in the darkness, their whispered prayers beneath the stars. They had been scattered, like sheep without a shepherd, their identity as the chosen ones nearly forgotten. But he had not abandoned them. He had not turned away from their pain. In those days, at that time, the Lord said, my people will seek me again. They will remember who they are. They will bind themselves to me in an everlasting covenant, never to be forgotten. And so, the call went forth. Flee from Babylon. Leave the land of the Chaldeans. Declare among the nations, the Lord has redeemed his people, the remnant of Israel. No longer would they be slaves. No longer would they weep in exile. The chains that bound them would be broken, the yoke of oppression lifted from their necks. The day of redemption had come, and the Lord himself would lead them home. I will bring Israel back to their pasture, and they will feed on Carmel and Bashan. Their hunger will be satisfied on the hills of Ephraim and Gilead. In those days and at that time, declares the Lord, search will be made for Israel's guilt, but there will be none, and for the sins of Judah, but none will be found. For I will forgive the remnant I spare. The people who had once been cast out, who had borne the shame of their sin and exile, would be restored. Their past would no longer define them. Their guilt would no longer chain them. The Lord would cleanse them, redeem them, call them his own once more. The nations would witness it. The rulers of the earth would tremble. For the God of Israel was a redeemer, a deliverer, a restorer of the broken. Babylon had been strong, but the Lord was stronger. The captors had been cruel, but the Lord was merciful. The exile had been long, but the promise of home was everlasting. And so, the people of Israel and Judah would rise. With tears of joy, with hearts renewed, they would turn their faces toward Zion. They would lift their voices in praise to the one who had never forsaken them. The Lord had spoken, the Lord had acted, and his people would be free. Do not be afraid, my servant Jacob, declares the Lord, for I am with you. Though I completely destroy all the nations among which I scatter you, I will not completely destroy you. I will discipline you, but only with justice. I will not let you go entirely unpunished. The road home lay ahead. The past was behind them. The future was secure, for the Lord redeems his people from captivity. Jeremiah 51. The everlasting power and justice of the Lord. See, I will defend your cause and avenge you. I will dry up her sea and make her springs dry. Babylon will be a heap of ruins, a haunt of jackals, an object of horror and scorn, a place where no one lives. The great city of Babylon stood tall, its walls stretching to the heavens, its towers reaching toward the sky, a kingdom of wealth, of power, of pride. It seemed unshakable, unconquerable. The nations trembled before its might. Kings bowed before its authority, and its people lived in the illusion of security. But the Lord saw beyond the walls, beyond the riches, beyond the pride that filled the hearts of its rulers. He saw their wickedness, their arrogance, their defiance of his name, and he spoke. Babylon must fall because of Israel's slain, just as the slain in all the earth have fallen because of Babylon. The city had been an instrument of God's judgment, used to humble the rebellious hearts of his people. But Babylon had gone too far. Its cruelty, its idolatry, its oppression had reached the heavens, and the Lord would not stand silent. Sharpen the arrows, take up the shields. The Lord has stirred up the kings of the Medes, because his purpose is to destroy Babylon. The armies of the north gathered, the nations stirred. The mighty kingdom that once devoured others would itself be devoured. The very land that swallowed captives would drink of its own destruction. The Lord had spoken, and nothing could stand against his word. Yet within the coming judgment, there was hope. Come out of her, my people. Run for your lives. Run from the fierce anger of the Lord. For even as the walls of Babylon stood proud, even as its idols lined the streets and its merchants prospered, there were those who did not belong to the city. The exiles, the remnant, those who still bore the name of the Lord. They were called to flee, to turn their backs on the world that had enslaved them, and to return to the God who had never forgotten them. The Redeemer is strong. The Lord Almighty is his name. He will vigorously defend their cause, so that he may bring rest to their land, but unrest to those who live in Babylon. The justice of God is not slow, nor is it uncertain. Though the proud may rise for a time, though the wicked may seem to rule, their days are numbered. The power of man is fleeting, but the power of the Lord is everlasting. He lifts up kings, and he brings them down. He allows the proud to rise, only to humble them in his perfect time. Babylon, the golden city, the symbol of human strength and defiance, would crumble into dust. Its idols, once worshipped, would be powerless to save it. Its warriors, once feared, would fall in terror. The rivers that once nourished its people would dry up. The walls that once stood as a defense would become nothing but rubble. But the name of the Lord would remain. You who live by many waters, and are rich in treasures, your end has come, the time for you to be destroyed. The earth would shake at the downfall of Babylon. The nations would mourn her destruction, for the wealth of the world had flowed through her streets. But for the people of God, her fall was a sign of their redemption. The Lord Almighty declares, Babylon's thick wall will be leveled, and her high gates set on fire. The peoples exhaust themselves for nothing. The nation's labor is only fuel for the flames. The mighty would be brought low. The strong would be overthrown. the idols of men would fall to the ground, and through it all the justice of the Lord would be revealed. For he is not slow in keeping his promises, he is not blind to the suffering of his people, nor is he indifferent to the evil of the world. Though it may seem that the wicked prosper, though it may appear that injustice reigns, the Lord sees, the Lord knows, and the Lord acts. He will repay Babylon for all the wrong they have done in Zion in your sight, declares the Lord. The exiles would return, the captives would be set free, the city of God would be restored, and the Lord himself would be their defender. No longer would they suffer under the hand of their oppressors, no longer would they live in the shadow of foreign gods. For the Lord is king, and his kingdom has no end. The sun began to set over the once glorious city. The towers that had reached the sky now stood crumbling. The streets that had once been filled with merchants now lay silent. The proud had fallen, the mighty had been humbled. The justice of the Lord had been made known, and his people, they lifted their eyes to heaven, knowing that their Redeemer lives. He who made the earth by his power, who established the world by his wisdom, and stretched out the heavens by his understanding. The Lord Almighty is his name.